I'm not generally one to embrace fringe ideas just for the sake of being some kind of unorthodox, attention chasing edgelord. But I do think it's important to be ahead of the herd. And in order to stay ahead, you have to investigate new ideas long before they receive the attention of the masses. Today, we are going to engage in such an inquiry. I think all of us involved in this channel, I and almost everyone listening, have lived in an era when globalism was the implicit order of the day. West and East, North and South have all been trading with each other. Most parts of the world, either fairly or unfairly, have been competing with most other parts of the world in a global economic system of production and consumption of goods and services. Today, we'll look at the theory held by some that this global system may be in its last days and what that could mean for Cardano. Ready? Let's go. Today, we will discuss this very big idea, this thesis around the potential, possible, imminent death of globalism. We'll talk about where globalism came from, why some people think we might be facing the death of globalism, what that would mean for the world, what it might mean for crypto, and what it would even mean for Cardano. If you objected to this image on the grounds that that globe looks like it is the product of terrible cartography and that dagger handle makes it look like it would be nearly impossible to hold, or if you're finding value in these videos each weekday, please consider delegating to the Army of Spies stake pool, ticker AOS. As we go through this, please understand I am not trying to convince you of this idea because I myself am unconvinced. In fact, if you knew anything about me, you would know that I quite enjoy the benefits of globalism. The fruits of globalism are something I enjoy. So, no need to label me as an anti globalist or anything crazy like that. But we are going to talk about this idea that's out there. I think it's important to consider all these types of ideas because they may turn out to be true, they may turn out to not be true. But if you don't consider these ideas ahead of time, you may get surprised by them. And so that we're all on the same page, here's the sort of very, very broad definition of globalism that we're operating off for the purposes of this video. Globalism is the operation or planning of economic and foreign policy on a global basis. This is just this idea that we have a global economy and there, to some extent, there's global foreign policy that's being executed upon. So we're not going to discuss this within the confines of a single definition's idea, a single person's ideas about globalism or the potential death of globalism or the decline of globalism. I don't want to hyper localize it to one personality. So we're going to talk in very broad terms about globalism roughly within the confines of this definition. Specifically, I know a lot of you probably watched the Peter Zahan podcast with Joe Rogan, where he talked about a lot of these same themes, but we're going to try to make this discussion a little broader and not just talk about his specific brand of this idea. Before we talk about the theories around the possible impending death of globalism, let's first talk about different theories as to why globalism exists in the first place. I think you've definitely got a more optimistic theory that I like, that globalism exists because we have a globe of human beings and different parts of that globe. Human beings are producing different goods and services. They have different comparative advantages. In some parts of the world, it's much easier to produce a certain good or service. And in some other parts of the world, it's tougher. So you want, to have some kind of global economy so that every part of the globe can produce the goods and services where they have a comparative advantage and be involved in this whole global system so that no one's left behind. So you can spread the prosperity across the globe of economic trade. So that's this optimistic theory. I like that optimistic theory. However, there are realists out there who would argue it's not really that at all. It's not this semi-altruistic vision of the entire, spreading prosperity across the globe and everyone being included in this global system. It's really this. Realists might argue it's really this. It was the Cold War. Realists might argue, hey, you had NATO and you had the Soviet Union and its allies, and the NATO countries, specifically the United States, didn't want the Soviet Union and its allies to spread, their style of communism slash socialism, depending on what you think that was, to any other countries in the globe. So they had this policy of containment, containing communism to the Warsaw Pact countries, along with China. This more realist theory continues the way they would contain communism to the Warsaw Pact countries, along with China and some of the other allies, Cuba and a few other countries. The way they would contain communism was through buying off other countries. They would buy them off through globalism. They would say, hey, if you promise not to go with those other countries, if you're on our side in the Cold War, then we'll do trade with you. We'll include you in our global network of trade. This will enrich your people, or if you're extremely corrupt, just the leaders, but it will enrich someone in your country because you'll be included in this network of global trade. So that's why you want to be on our side and not be involved in the expansion of communism from the countries on the other side of this Cold War. Whether you believe in that more optimistic theory or in the more realist based theory around the Cold War, what we do know is that the Cold War ended roughly with the dissolution of the Soviet Union on the 26th of December in 1991. But globalism has continued and flourished, and we definitely have this global economy, and there's coordinated global uh, policy outside of just economics. All of it seems to be to aid this sort of global economy and the health of the global economy. So things did continue past the Cold War. So, why would the system of globalism continue after the cessation of the Cold War? Because even though there was no longer a Soviet Union, we still had a Russia who was not an ally of the United States or of pretty much any Western European country you could name. So, there was still a need for containment because while Russia had receded to far different borders than the borders of the USSR, there was still a perceived need for containment of Russia. The realists would argue that the Western countries were still going to be afraid of a resurgent Russia rolling into Western Europe across the borders of the former Eastern Bloc countries and into Western Europe, which is the exact same fear they held during the Cold War. In the post Cold War era, we also saw the economic rise of China, and with it, a lot of saber rattling, especially toward Taiwan. And the realists would argue that this was another benefit of the continuation of globalism, that the Western countries could sort of buy a certain amount of global policy coordination to address the rise of China as an economic superpower. So, why would people be predicting a death of globalism right now then? Well, if they're following that realist line of thinking about containment of Russia and China, then it could have something to do with big publications like Fortune publishing articles like this. Russia's population is in a historic decline as immigration war and a plunging birth rate form a perfect storm. I think a lot of us probably understand that the prime driver of economic expansion is demographic expansion. If your population is growing, your economy is expanding. If you have demographic contraction, if your population is contracting, then your economic power is also likely contracting. And this article says a demographic reckoning has arrived for Russia. Its economy starved of young employees and now at risk of stagnation or worse long after the war is over. For Putin, who just turned 70, Russian demography has long been an existential issue. And just last year, he declared that saving the people of Russia is our top national priority. But as Russia approached the invasion of Ukraine in February, that's February of last year, it was coming off its deadliest year since World War II, made worse by the pandemic, with the population in decline since 2018. Let me repeat that. The population of Russia has been in decline since 2018. It reached 145.1 million on August 1st. And this is a fall from 148.3 million in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. Yes, the population is less now in the Russian Federation than it was in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. This is not good for the expansion of economic power. You probably know that the magic demographic number is a birth rate of 2.1 children per woman. That's the amount needed to keep populations stable in the absence of migration, which is something they don't have in Russia. They don't have in migration in Russia to make up for a low birth rate. But in Russia, the Fortune article is saying the continuation of the military campaign and mobilization until the end of next spring would be catastrophic, likely bringing births down to just 1 million in the 12 months to mid 2024. The fertility rate may reach 1.2 children per woman. That's not 2.1 that they would need to keep their population stable. So if all of this happens, and they're already seeing population decline, if all of this happens, the population decline in the Russian Federation just goes worse. You can already see where this is going. People are arguing that globalism will no longer be required to buy global policy coordination to contain Russian territorial expansionist impulses because as Russia suffers demographic decline, they'll also suffer economic decline and they'll be a much less significant threat. You could also argue that as Russia is suffering this type of demographic economic decline, they're also probably suffering the effects of decades of kleptocracy. Certainly, people are arguing that as a reason for the dramatic failures of the Russian military in Ukraine right now. So you might say, okay, maybe even if we buy into that case for a lack of a need for globalism to address Russia, there's still China. But what we see with China is exactly the same thing. Here's an article in Forbes titled China's Demographics. It gets worse. So again, remember, we just talked about the 2.1 birth rate, 2.1 children per woman birth rate to maintain a population. This article says China's National Bureau of Statistics said the country's population grew by just 480,000 people in 2021. That seems like a large number, but not in the context of the gigantic population of China. A record low increase that brought it up to 1.4 billion. A decade ago, annual population growth was around 8 million. So 10 years ago, we were seeing population increase in China of 8 million people a year. In 2021, we saw 480,000. The article says we won't know for a few more months, but this suggests an absolute decline in population in 2022, the first decline in 60 years. This is extremely dramatic. They're saying they've gone from 8 million people being added to the population every year to 2022 probably being a negative growth in population. The article says, more importantly, the total fertility rate, births per woman, dropped in 2021 to just 1.15. Obviously, this is very similar to what's happening in Russia, far below the 2.1 required for stable population. So, what does all this mean? Well, if you believe in this thesis of an impending death of globalism, you might believe that the main policy interests of the Western countries since World War II has been containing the socialist communist threat from countries like Russia and China. And now here we are, decades past the end of the Cold War. And if we have an demographically and economically contracting Russia, and if we have a demographically and economically contracting China, you have to ask the question, is there any longer a need for the Western countries to engage in globalism to buy the policy cooperation of countries around the globe? Maybe they no longer have a need or a desire to engage in that kind of globalism because they no longer feel the need to contain an expanding Russia and an expanding China. Maybe things break down. Maybe this system of globalism breaks down into several systems of regional trade networks. You could imagine some combination of Canada, the US, Mexico, the EU, Australia, New Zealand, Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan being sort of one trading network, and then other regional trading networks being established in all of the other regions of the world. I'm not saying I find this convincing, and it is hard to predict if this is one possible future. It is hard to predict on what kind of timeline this kind of breakdown of globalism could occur. But I think, as one possible vision of the future, it's important to think about what this would look like. So, if we think about this in the context of crypto, I think this would be a pretty fertile environment for Cardano and for crypto. So, if you have these regional trading relationships, globalism breaks down. Of course, there are still going to be products, services, and resources that a trading network like this Canada, U.S., Mexico, EU, and associated nation states. There are still going to be resources they're going to need to produce goods, and also goods and services from outside their trade network they're going to need. But these other regional trade associations, if the US, if the Western countries retract, they're not going to really have a need necessarily to use the US dollar as the unit of account for international trade any longer. They might still like the dollar, they might still want the dollar, but these other regional trade associations, they're probably going to choose to use other currencies they might control. And for some of these regions that don't have very stable currencies, I could see crypto filling that spot that US dollars currently fill. Crypto would be the perfect money for international trade, and trade of all types. When I say international trade, it could just be between one sort of consumer, even with some supplier of something, a good or service or natural resource, outside of that trade network. And if globalism is broken down, then trust will have also broken down. If no one's any longer using the dollar, they're not necessarily going to trust, the whatever currency is being used by the central bank, in another sort of trade network. It's a perfect environment for crypto. And if you think about what cryptocurrency they're going to use, I think if trust has broken down because globalism has broken down, it's going to be the most decentralized cryptocurrency that they're going to trust. If we look at the list of top 10 cryptos right now, we've got Bitcoin. Their rallying cry is decentralization, but when you compare them to Cardano, they're not very decentralized. The block production is pretty centralized in just a handful of block producing pools. If we think about Ethereum, same thing. The block validation is much more centralized than Cardano. Of course, we've got Tether. Tether is a stable coin, and there are big questions about centralized control of Tether. Next up, we have BNB. BNB is Binance. Whenever anybody's dealing with Binance, they inevitably end up asking the question, how much control could the CCP possibly have over Binance? That's a question that is often asked in crypto. I personally like CZ, but it's hard to debate that the CCP might have a lot of potential control over any entity in crypto or otherwise where you've got a lot of Chinese nationals running the entity. Then you've got USDC coin. USDC coin, I mean, it's pretty hard to say that that's not controlled, almost purely by interests in North America. So somebody outside of the sort of North America, Europe, Commonwealth, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan trading network, they may not want to deal with a purely, North American controlled coin. Then you've got XRP, famous for the level of centralization. You've got another Binance related coin, and then you've got Cardano. Cardano is more decentralized than any of these other top 10 cryptos we've talked about, and it's global. It's not controlled purely by North American entities like something like a USDC. It's not controlled by an entity where people ask questions about the level of influence that the CCP might have, like Binance. That sounds really pejorative to say that about Binance because I like CZ, but this is a concern that comes up time and time again in crypto with Binance. Then you've got, beyond Cardano, you've got Dogecoin. Dogecoin has no programmability. It's not going to be the most versatile coin to use in this post-globalism era of international trade. So again, I'm not saying I believe in this version of the future over any other possible version of the future. But if we do end up in an era of post globalism, I think crypto is perfectly positioned to be the money of any kind of international trade in that kind of an environment. And Cardano seems perfectly positioned among the other large cap cryptocurrency to be the kind of unit of account for trade that people would choose given the breakdown in trust that you might have in a post globalist era. I hope you are getting ready to have a fantastic week, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.